And the 3-week series is on a Mahayana text. So the Mahayana was the kind of second phase of Buddhism. And it's a text called the Vimalakirti Nidesha, which means the teaching of Vimalakirti. And what we've been exploring is the central character of this text. And we're basing it on Sangha, who is the founder of our order and movement. This text that he wrote called The Inconceivable Emancipation. So you have a picture of Vimalakirti here. And we've been looking at who is Vimalakirti. That's the question that we've been trying to answer. And in trying to answer that question, really what we've been exploring is what does this approach to Buddhism mean? What's the Mahayana getting at, and what does it mean for us and our lives? And the first week, we looked at Vimalakirti and the Buddha. And the second week, we looked at Vimalakirti and the Dharma. And the third week, we're looking at this week, Vimalakirti and the Sangha. So the Buddha, we have on the shrine here. Obviously, the Buddha gained enlightenment 2,500 years ago, passed his teachings on, was an enlightened being. The Dharma, which is his teachings, and the Sangha, which is the spiritual community. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to give a little bit of a recap and an introduction, and then I'm going to invite Suvarnajyoti back to start talking about Sangha. So I've reached that marvellous milestone in life of middle age where I have to get my glasses out before I can say any more. So please bear with me. So I started off in the first week talking about Vimalakirti, and I was talking about this in relation to, I spent a lot of time talking about ideas of what is kind of true and what is untrue and what is fact and what is myth. So I spent a lot of time talking about myth. So we have the Buddha on the shrine here, but as you'll notice, the Buddha here is kind of golden. He's huge. He's got these huge ears. So he's kind of, he's not actually how the Buddha would have looked. You know, if you'd have bumped into the Buddha 2,500 years ago, as some people did, he wouldn't have looked like this. This is a kind of a mythical, poetical representation of the Buddha. So the Buddha actually appears in the Vimalakirti Nidesha, but he's not the Buddha, the actual human being from 2,500 years ago. That's what we call the historical Buddha. But you find the Buddha in the Vimalakirti Nidesha as a kind of mythical figure. And Vimalakirti is a mythical figure in a slightly different way to the Buddha. So Vimalakirti is, you could sort of say he's a fictional character, but that's not quite right either. That doesn't quite do it. So I spent a little bit of time in the first week sort of talking about, well, what is myth? What do we actually mean when we talk about myth? Was anybody here that first week? So you'll probably remember everything I said in great detail. So does anybody can anybody just chuck out anything that I talked about in relation to myth? I don't mean throw it out as rubbish, I mean throw it out as recall. Sophie, yeah.
I remember that you said the great myth of your life has been Star Wars.
Right, yeah. That's not like 100% accurate. I think I said I've been very influenced by that myth. I think now it's fair to say I'm a bit more into Buddhism than Star Wars. Just a little bit. But no, that's true. So I quoted Star Wars. So I was talking about the myth of Star Wars, and I was saying, like, there are only a certain number of stories in the world, you know, sort of stories, myths, and one of them is, the being that sets out on a spiritual path, overcomes obstacles, changes in the process, all of that sort of thing. And I was talking about how Star Wars influenced my life. So as a young boy growing up in the 1970s, it was pretty obligatory to be into Star Wars, but I loved it. When I was a kid, I wanted to either be a samurai or a Jedi when I grew up, not knowing that those weren't realistic career options. I think an order member's actually, lots of people would argue this, but it's quite close to being a Jedi, I think. Anyway, that's up for debate, obviously. Young man, his father dies, he leaves home, spiritual quest, finds a strange teacher, all of that sort of thing. This was the myth of Luke Skywalker. And I was saying that actually what was weird about that was, for me, that actually came true. So my father died when I was quite young. I set off on a spiritual quest, found a strange teacher with pointy ears and a funny laugh, for those of you that know Jnanavacha. Anyway, so myths. So what is that? It's a story, and it's not true in one sense, but you could say it's sort of truer than truth. A friend of mine, I was talking to someone the other day, and he was saying, has anybody read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest here? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So apparently there's a line in that book, which I haven't read, but I thought this was fantastic, which said that what happened in this story is true, even if it didn't happen. And I thought, that's great, isn't it? Like, all stories, in a sense, are trying to point to something. Often they might incorporate true events, but they're trying to point to a deeper truth about human experience. And that truth may not always occur in the day-to-day course of our lives. It's often to do with magic and myth, poetry, symbolism, but it's pointing to something that is sort of truer than true. And I've realised I'm taking way too long to do this recap and introduction, so I will speed up a little bit. So I spent a long time talking about myth, and I also talked about the mystery of the Buddha. And Vimalakirti really points to this. He's a deeply mysterious figure, and he in turn is trying to communicate something of the magic and mystery and myth of the Buddha's teaching and of the Buddha. So he's a deeply mysterious figure, and he's pointing to something mysterious as well. And I was saying, what we all have a tendency to do is we want to understand the world, and we have a tendency to think that we can understand things and that they can be understood on their own level. So I think this is true with the Buddha's teaching, isn't it? Is we often think, oh, well, if I just had the right information, I would understand it. So, for example, when I first came along to the Buddhist Center, I just used to buy books all the time thinking, this one will have the information that I need. No, that one will have the information I need. And then I'll really understand it all. And actually, that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to actually change our consciousness. And our consciousness changes, and as it changes, then we start to understand. But the Dharma is not something that can be understood on its own level. We have to ascend to a higher level to understand it. We think it's the other way around, and we have a tendency to bring the Buddha down to our own level. So, like you get pink fluffy Buddhas in Liberty, don't you? And you see Buddhas outside Thai restaurants and all that sort of thing. It's like we brought the Buddha down to our level, but he's not at our level. All we can do is try to ascend to the Buddha's level. And it's a mistake to think that we understand the Buddha. And at the same time, it's a mistake to think that he's completely separate from us. It's like there must be something in us that has an inkling of what the Buddha was pointing to. Otherwise, what would be the point? It's not something that's completely beyond us. There's something in us that resonates with something in what the Buddha taught, but it's not that we're at that level. So Suvarnajyoti was talking about this last week, and I was thinking it's kind of like we're on two levels, aren't we? So there's relative truth, and then there's absolute truth. So we can understand things on a relative level, but the Buddha and Vimalakirti hold both. So they understand from a sort of a higher perspective, but also they are. The Buddha was talking to ordinary human beings, and in the text, Vimalakirti does that as well. He's able to talk to enlightened beings, to ordinary beings, and to communicate to them in a way that helps them to grow. Okay, so actually what I'm going to do is invite Suvarnajyoti up and just say what we're going to do this evening is we're going to talk about sort of all of that kind of thing, and who is Vimalakirti? And we're going to try and do that in relation to talking about the third jewel. So when you came in this evening, we saluted the three jewels. So we said Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dhammaya, Namo Sanghaya. And Sanghaya means the Sangha, so it means the spiritual community. So it means us, but it also means everyone who has practiced Buddhism and those beings who have attained enlightenment and passed the teaching on. And we're going to sort of explore a little bit tonight about Vimalakirti in relation to Sangha. So I'll invite you back up. It's a bit of an experiment, this kind of tag team thing, but we thought it'd be nice to sort of do this as a conversation.
Yeah.
Do you want to get your cushions?
Are those?
Yeah, you can sit there.
Yeah.
It's all right.
Or maybe. I feel like I have my back to people, so maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, that's better. I think. That'll be all right. I think.
Yeah.
Right.
So those of us that wear these things called cases, welcome, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
Those of us that wear these cases, that means we're ordained Buddhists, so we're ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order, which this centre and lots of centres around the world are part of. And when you're ordained, you get this thing put around your neck for the first time, which is called a kesa. And it's a symbol of our commitment to the path, basically. So we've both committed to follow the path of Buddhism for the rest of our lives. And this is a symbol of that. And on this kesa, there are 3 little symbols here, and they're 3 jewels. So you've got the jewels for the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. So for a Buddhist, these things are the most precious things in our lives. The Buddha, obviously who we've talked about, you know who the Buddha is. Well, none of us know who the Buddha is, but never mind. And the Dharma, his teaching. But it's interesting, it's the teaching, but it's also, you could say, the principle of... so there is the actual teaching, but the teaching is pointing to something, which is the principle of enlightenment at work in the universe, and the Sangha, which is the spiritual community. So those are here on our cases, and the Sangha is one of those jewels. And I kind of wanted to start off the discussion a little bit this evening, just saying... that it's interesting, isn't it, that metaphor, we don't talk about it that often, but the Sangha as a jewel, you're looking at me like really puzzled. This is a good start, isn't it? The Sangha as a jewel. So why a jewel? Like, I was thinking, a few things that came to my mind are, obviously a jewel is very precious, it's very beautiful. Well, actually, why don't we open this up to you? Why do you think we might call the 3 jewels, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, why do we call them jewels? What are the qualities of a jewel?
Rare.
They're rare, right? That's interesting. Yeah. So they're rare, which means they're sort of hard to come by, isn't it? And they're all the more valuable because they are rare as well. Yeah. Anything else?
Pure.
Say again?
Pure.
Pure. So say a bit more about that, Tom.
Well, diamond is made of carbon arranged in a certain way.
Yeah.
There's nothing else in it. It's
So it's pure. Yeah, that's so pure. The carbon thing's interesting, isn't it? Because they're made under intense pressure as well, aren't they? So diamonds, I presume, all jewels are made under an intense pressure as well. So that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Any other qualities?
You would keep a jewel close to you.
Ah, okay.
So there's a sort of sacredness about it, or sort of importance that hold close to you.
That's right. Yeah. So you wouldn't just kind of you wouldn't be sort of fast and loose with that, would you? It would be something that you would keep close to you and you would value immensely. Yeah. Yeah. So I was also thinking about a jewel as well, that it's sort of multifaceted, isn't it, as well? And it's got, like if you were to sort of turn a jewel, you can look at it from different perspectives, and there are different sort of ways in as well. So I thought that was just an interesting sort of introduction, isn't it? That the Sangha is a jewel. Why do we sort of call it a jewel? Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I'm wondering when you're going to go back on script.
Okay. Yeah. Well, this leads me on to... so in the text... Thanks, bringing me back to the text. In the text, there's a section where Bhante talks about how the Bodhisattva creates community is a teaching called the Sangra vastus. And that gets translated in different ways, but in the text, Bhante talks about it as the means of unification. So because a bodhisattva sees with that kind of wisdom perspective, there is a deep, deep, deep compassion for all beings. And when a being feels compassion for all beings, he doesn't sit down and think, oh, what's the best thing I can do for these beings? He just naturally does that. So he naturally behaves in a way that is the most beneficial thing he can do for all beings, without even having to think about it. And in the case of Vimalakirti, and in the text, it talks about the teaching of the sangra vastus, and that gets translated as means of unification, which is basically creating sangha, isn't it? So a bodhisattva would naturally create sangha. It's interesting, I was thinking about this in relation to Sangharakshita, who's the founder of our order. So he wouldn't describe himself as a bodhisattva, but it seems like that's what he did basically throughout his life, wasn't it? He just naturally created sangha. People just gathered around him. He didn't sort of, I mean, you could say he tried to do that. I don't know, that's what he wanted to do. But naturally people would just sort of gather and community was created around him. So the first sangra vastu, which I finally got to, is dana. So it's like the sangra vastus are these 4 things that a bodhisattva does, 4 things that a bodhisattva practices in order to create sangha. And the first one is dana. So do you want to say something about that?
Yes. Thank you very much. Yes. Okay. So these 4 principles, we're going to be sort of exploring them. Obviously, we'll just be able to touch on them this evening. But these 4 principles for creating sangha, these means of unification. Another translation I came across was essentials of cooperation. And we're going to be exploring and thinking about those specifically in relation to our experiences of Sangha here at the London Buddhist Centre. Now, if you're new here at the Buddhist Centre or you haven't been coming along for very long, don't worry about that. We'll find another way for you to tune into that. Because actually one of the things about these 4 principles is they were teachings of the Buddha, and they were principles that bodhisattvas would use in order to grow the Sangha. But they also actually, they just kind of make sense in terms of any situation in which you're trying to help people cooperate and flourish. So the first of the 4 sangra vastus is dana, which is the Buddhist word for generosity. So obviously generosity can mean many, many things, but tonight we're specifically thinking of generosity as a within the Sangha, as a way of kind of nurturing positive contact, positive relationship between people within a spiritual community. So like a personal links, what we might give to people just to kind of establish kind of spiritual connection with someone, but through a personal act of generosity. So so examples of that might be giving gifts, giving cards, giving something to someone within the community. And it's something that's quite different to if you sort of just joined a club somewhere or you joined a society. Just wouldn't have that same kind of quality of generosity and giving. You know, for one example would be that, you know, the London Buddhist Centre actually does everything we can to operate under a principle of generosity, which basically means you can come to this class, we give this class to you for free. And that's our kind of act of generosity, if you like, from the London Buddhist Centre. And then if you want to give us a donation for the class, you give that donation freely. So it's not that you pay the money and we give you the class, it's that we give you the class because we choose to, and you give us some money if you choose to help us run the centre. And then that way we're kind of all contributing to the centre. So can you see how that's a different mentality? It's not an exchange mentality, it's a spirit of generosity. So if we give things to people how am I doing time? Okay. If we give things to each other within the spiritual community, you know, I've been on the receiving end. I mean, I've been here for 20 years and I've been very lucky. I've been on the receiving end of that. And you do feel really valued and you feel really seen. And then when you are the one that does the giving, it just feels really nice. It feels really abundant. I remember one retreat I was on quite a long time ago now. It was before I was ordained, and I was on the team for the retreat, and I'd recently started a generosity practice. So I had this thing that if I had a thought in my mind, a generous thought in my mind, that I would follow through with it. And there was a young woman on this retreat, and I had a certain top, my favourite top that I wore like practically every day on retreat. And she really liked this top, and I was really flattered because I was kind of heading into middle age at the time, and here was this like cool young 22-year-old who liked my top. And at the end of the retreat, I gave her the top. And it was a really interesting thing because it was my favourite top. You know, it's easy to give away something that you don't really want in the first place, isn't it? But you give away your favourite top. And she was like, oh, she just, you know, and it been on retreat with me, it stank of onions, you know, all of that. But she was like, oh, thank you so much. And oh my God, I was on a high for like 3 days after that. It was just really striking to me, the effect that it had on me. Yeah, then many years later, she actually moved in next door to where I live now. And I was looking, I said, I recognise you. And she was like, yeah, I'm Hannah. You gave me your top at Vidrasana like 12 years ago. And I was like, oh my goodness me. So, yeah, so that's just a bit of an example. So that's, I think should we move on to the second one?
Did you ask her if it still smelled of onions?
No, I didn't ask her if she still had it. I should have asked for it back by then, shouldn't I? Yeah. So that's the first one, dana, generosity. So we're going to do 2 before the tea break and 2 after the tea break, basically.
Okay,
Shall we?
Great. Yeah.
Yeah?
I just wanted to add to that. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think with all of these, they work on whatever level, don't they? So
Sure.
You were saying, like, with all of these, they're qualities which are actually quite helpful just for people kind of working
just
together.
for human beings.
And I was sort of imagining, what I've been doing during this series is I've been kind of imagining like Vimalakirti there when we're trying to describe him, thinking, what would he say, what would he do?
Yeah.
And it's like, what I love about all of these qualities is that from a Buddhist perspective, or say from the Buddha's perspective, or from Vimalakirti's perspective, it's like that works just on a level of just being generous and just day-to-day sort of thing. And they have the perspective of seeing how intimately connected all beings are and not feeling the usual separation that beings feel from each other, and not feeling those impulses towards selfishness, towards greed, all of those sorts of things. And that's where their generosity comes from. So it's a completely pure generosity. So it's interesting with all of these qualities, I think, isn't it? They're both path and fruit. So the Bodhisattva's generosity is completely unbounded and comes from that wisdom perspective. But for us, we can enjoy maybe a glimpse of that perspective, but it's also a training for us as well that takes us closer to that perspective as well. So I just wanted to sort of put that in there, really. Yes.
Yes. So we're going to move on to the second one.
So we are.
So the second one.
So the second one
and we just need to be slightly aware of, like, if we're going to have time.
Okay. Yeah. So the second one is Priyavadita, or loving speech, which is interesting, isn't it? Because it is actually, it's like a form of generosity, but it's generosity, loving kindness in the form of speech. Bhante talks about this in the text. I love this. He talks about it as not holding back, basically. So it's like, but not holding back in a very loving kind of way, basically. So expressing when we really care for people. So letting them know that we really appreciate them, letting them know that we really love them, letting them know that we've, maybe that we've appreciated something about them or we've seen something in them, and encouraging those qualities through loving speech, basically, and expressing that speech. So again, from the Bodhisattva's perspective, this comes completely from awareness of people's potential. And what the Bodhisattva is trying to do is encourage people beyond their limited experience of themselves, basically. So you could say that the Buddha knows us better than we know ourselves. I don't know if you've ever had an experience of this. I've had it here, where I've got teachers that are much wiser than I am, and sometimes it's like they know me better than I know myself. And I really trust their perspective. So when they tell me qualities that they've seen in me, or they make observations about me, it's like when I've heard that over and over again, it's dismantled a limited view that I have of myself, because I trust their judgment and I know that they're wiser than I am, and they see my potential. So in Triratna we have this practice of rejoicing in merits, where we celebrate each other's positive qualities, and we name that, and we encourage each other, and we will, we have situations like on team retreats or on each other's birthdays or so on, where we will sort of name positive qualities in each other. And I think what that does is it helps us to break through our limited view of ourselves. So in a minute we're gonna sort of put you into pairs, and we're going to ask if you've had experience of, if you've been on the positive receiving end of dana or generosity, or if you've had an experience of practicing it and it's had an effect on you, or it could be the same with loving speech as well. And I think the thing with loving speech, with Priyavadita, is looking at it from this perspective, so from the Bodhisattva's perspective of trying to encourage positive qualities in each other. I think we tend to massively underestimate the positive effect that has on people when we do that. Like, we tend to think it's quite a small thing, don't we?
Yeah, you're very good at it, actually.
Right, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I'm cutting in.
No, that's all right. Okay.
Yeah. But you're very good at that. And
right.
I've noticed that you're very good at kind of rejoicing in people and it having a positive effect.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, funny enough, I was going to say something. I was walking here tonight, and I was thinking of a similar thing. You know, when people become mitras, and they make it's like a first commitment on the path, basically, where people publicly decide that they are a Buddhist, that they're going to practice within Triratna for the moment, and that they have a ceremony where they say that publicly, and people give them cards at their mitra ceremony, don't you? And I still remember.
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, you gave me a card on my mitra ceremony when you didn't know who I was. And I still remember that now. It made such a difference. Like, we've been friends now for about 20 years.
Well, since then, probably.
Since then.
Since that moment.
And I still remember, like, I felt it was such a big thing at the time. I thought, God, somebody's given me a card to say, like, I remember you saying, welcome to the Mitra Sangha, and not even knowing who I was. And I thought, God, that's what an incredible thing that someone would even do that when they don't know who you are. And I still remember that after all these years. And that's the sort of thing, isn't it? These things can have such a positive effect, and we may not even think about that at the time. Okay, so what we'd like you to do is to get into pairs and think about these first two sangra vastus, so dana, or generosity, or priyavadita, loving speech. Have you practiced these, and what's the effect been? And I'm thinking, can you think of specific incidents? Or have you been on the receiving end of these, and has that had an effect on you? So get into pairs, and let's see what you think about that. So just before we get on to the sangra vastus, I was thinking a little bit about... I don't think it was Bhante, but I think it was somebody else in our order who gave a talk on Vimalakirti, was talking about... Vimalakirti as being actually the embodiment of Sangha, which is quite interesting. So it's actually a figure who represents the spiritual community in the text. And that's quite an interesting thing to think about, I think. And then I was thinking about it in relation to... So in the text, those of you that have been here over the last couple of weeks, Suvarnajyoti, you were talking last week about how uncompromising Vimalakirti is, and how... like we're talking about generosity and loving speech and all that sort of thing, and that is wonderful, isn't it? All of that is really wonderful. And from like Vimalakirti is actually makes people feel quite uncomfortable sometimes. Like in the text, there are some people that don't want to go and see him when he's ill. And the reason why they've said that basically is because they're just frightened that they're going to be criticised by him. And I think it's quite an interesting idea, isn't it? Because being part of a Sangha is wonderful, and I wouldn't want to live my life any other way. And it's like it's not always comfortable, because part of that is, we're all imperfect, aren't we? So we make mistakes, and we're trying to be completely honest and open all the time. That's how we're trying to relate to each other in the Sangha, is, in terms of truthfulness and openness and honesty and clarity and all those sorts of things. And we're imperfect and we make mistakes, so we're going to bump up against each other. And I sometimes find it a bit humiliating being around people that are a lot wiser than I am all the time. Like, just kind of, it makes you realise how unwise you are sometimes. That's how I feel. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. But
no, definitely. I think it's a really good point, because we are, coming into the third Sangra Vastu, which is talking about beneficial activity, which is about doing things that are helpful for people's spiritual growth. And I think one of the things you're talking about is, if we're really serious about growing spiritually, if we're really serious about, becoming calmer and more positive and seeing through the illusions of our ordinary day-to-day life, and seeing through to the reality that the Buddha saw, if we're really serious about that path, which, for those of us that are ordained, becoming ordained is a mark of a level of seriousness of practice. But you may not be ordained, but you also may be practicing that quite seriously. We actually need to be challenged by each other at times, because we do have our blind spots, and we do have to grow. And we do have to sometimes have someone go, actually, when you do that, this is the effect that it has, and that's not great. And then there's the humiliation aspect of that, oh dear,
Like, growth isn't always comfortable, is it? But I don't know, I find it refreshing to be in a context where I know that people will actually be honest with me. So it's kind of like, it's not the flip side, but it's another aspect of the thing that I was talking about in terms of loving speech. Is sometimes loving speech is actually pointing out to somebody when they might need to look at something, but I find it really refreshing to know that people will actually say that to me, rather than, say, for example, I've been in work contexts before where I know people just wouldn't, they're not likely to say something. They're much more likely to just want a quiet life, or want a sort of a false harmony. Whereas I'm much more...
Or just moan about you behind your back.
Right,
or something.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. Where it's sort of, it can be uncomfortable, but it can be very refreshing when people will actually be honest with you, even if it's not completely comfortable, I think. And that can really help you to grow as well, I think. Yeah,
and that's like the moment, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but that's, for me, I think that's a key moment of spiritual growth, is times when someone has called me on something and said, look at what you're doing here, look at what's going on. And it's just quite squirmy, isn't it? And uncomfortable. But in a way, that's the moment of spiritual growth, is like, can I drop my ego sort of defensive reaction to that, and hear what they've got to say and try to use it to grow. Because we've only got to look around the world to see what happens, what is happening on a global scale, on a national scale, when people are challenging other people, and those people are reacting from a place of a sort of ego-driven defensive reaction. And then, all we can do is work with that in our own psyche, because we can see the effect that it has out in the world when that runs amok.
And also, I think it's completely different when that comes from, when that comes from a place of love, or when that comes from a place of kindness. It's very, very different, isn't it? So it's interesting you say that, because I was talking with my partner at the weekend. She's also ordained as well, and we were talking about this idea of loving speech and the effect that it has on the world. And she said, "Can you imagine if the world was just like completely full of this?" Like, would we still have newspapers, for example? If it was like all written communication was sort of loving and truthful and honest. And can you imagine what it would be like if politicians practiced loving speech? Like, it would be radically different, wouldn't it? Can you imagine the Houses of imagine Prime Minister's questions, where it would be like genuinely sort of loving and kind.
Imagine the American election.
Imagine the American election. Yeah. It'd just be such a different world, wouldn't it? Yes.
So I think that's a good example of what you were saying in the first half about that these principles, they are from the Buddha, and they too, at the highest level, they're principles of profound wisdom. But actually, on a very day-to-day level, I don't think any of us would really argue with the fact that, being generous and being, kind of kindly and thoughtful in your speech to others is going to have a positive effect in any kind of group context.
That's right. I remember the first time I experienced rejoicing in merit was a teacher when I was 17.
Oh.
And I'd never,
What,
never
you mean like a
anything.
normal, like college teacher?
Normal school teacher in sixth form got us to go round and rejoice in each other. And everybody said something positive about everyone else. And my partner, who I was talking about just now, so she was a school teacher, and she used to do that with her students. So on their birthdays, all the students would rejoice in the person whose birthday it is, and then they'd get the choice of whether they had a birthday cake or pizza for everyone. And I just thought, what a fantastic thing.
But did she do that because she was a Buddhist? Or
she did that before? She did that because she was a Buddhist.
Oh,
but the teacher who did it with me, I mean, this was like, 30-something years ago. She just had got that from somewhere and felt like it'd be a good thing to do. And I still remember how powerful that was, And it lifted the atmosphere,
Absolutely.
It was transformative. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway. So
we've sort of already slightly segued into beneficial activity, haven't we? So that's another bit. There's another area of sort of overlap there between loving speech and into beneficial activity. So beneficial activity, doing something that spiritually benefits somebody else. So one of the challenges with this is that one has to be slightly careful, because you might think that something is really going to spiritually benefit someone else, and they might really not be that interested in it. So we have to be sort of sensitive that we're not sort of imposing something onto others. But, for example, from my own life, just finding opportunities to share your inspiration, or to, if you've been on retreat, or you've been to a really great talk, or you've been on a course or something, and, you're talking about it, you could share your inspiration, and then people do, that does have an effect on people. Whatever we talk about has an effect on the people that are listening. So, people tend to think of this beneficial activity thing as teaching the Dharma, like, sitting here teaching, which of course it, hopefully is a beneficial activity, but actually it's way broader than that. It's sort of anything that's going to support the spiritual growth of somebody, well, within a Sangha context, anything that's going to support people's spiritual growth. So when I was thinking about this, I was actually, the person that came to mind for me was a man called Maitreya Raja, who some of you will know. He's been around this centre for longer than I have. He's probably been ordained for over 20 years, because he's always been ordained the whole time I've been here. So, and he's a very, very understated, quiet, reserved man. And, he's a very experienced practitioner, over 20 years ordained. He's led big retreats, he's done loads of teaching. And, part of his job at the London Buddhist Centre is to clean it. And that's part of what he does for his job. And I don't know how he feels about that, but he always does it with such graciousness. Whenever I see him, he's just very on it, and he's very gracious about it. And yet, he he's a very experienced practitioner, he's a very senior practitioner. So for me, there's something in that that's about beneficial activity. It's like someone needs to be the caretaker at the centre. So he's going to be the caretaker at the centre, because if we didn't have a caretaker, we wouldn't, well, you can imagine a place would be like really scuzzy. And, that wouldn't be spiritually beneficial, because people would come in and they go, ooh, it's a bit scuzzy, I'm not going back there. So do you see what I mean about how there's all sorts of things that can be beneficial activity towards someone's spiritual development, not just, being up front and sort of doing formal teaching.
So is there a thing there, do you think, about like being responsive and doing what needs to be done?
Yeah. Well, that's how I was thinking of it. Although it tends to be talked about in terms of teaching, I was thinking actually it's much broader than that.
Well, I was thinking about being on retreat teams.
Yeah.
Like that's such a, like all the retreats that we run are run by volunteers. We couldn't do that if we didn't have people coming and helping out on retreat teams. Like everything that everyone does on a retreat,
including the teaching,
is like people just deciding that they want to do that because they've been the recipient of that. They understand how beneficial it can be, and they want to give freely of doing that. I mean, that's how we met each other, wasn't it? It was being on retreat teams loads when we first.
Well, after I gave you that Mitra card, but
right,
we didn't
after
really.
Yeah.
But the first time we actually properly started hanging out was being on winter retreat teams.
That's a lovely way to get to know people, and is actually just working together, isn't it? It's doing something together. So rather than it's nice just meeting people for coffee and that sort of thing. But I think there's nothing that bonds people and builds Sangha more than like working together. Actually like being on a retreat team together, working hard to do something together that's beneficial for other people.
Yeah, and I think the important thing about that as well is that, why are we doing it? And the thing, my experience of being on a retreat team, why I find it so inspiring, is because everybody's invested in the same project, which is to make the retreat go as positively as possible for the retreatants. So it's an act of like wanting people to have a really, really fruitful and positive retreat. But why do we need to do that in a sense? Why do we need to build Sangha? We're sitting here tonight talking about the importance of building Sangha. Why don't you just kind of go home and look at some taped meditations on Insight Timer or something like that. And actually, I think it's really worth saying that if we're going to make any kind of progress, we absolutely need the support of other like-minded people. It's extremely rare to make significant spiritual progress without a context in which to do that, because the rest of the world out there is really, really not going to do anything to support your spiritual progress, because it's not in the interests of the normal forces of the world for you to become calmer and happier and spend less money, for example. So there's something there about we're swimming again. If we're interested in this Buddhism thing, whatever that means, we're swimming against a tide. The tide of sort of the culture outside. And it's not that we want to totally reject and turn our back on that, because we're in that. We want to be in that, but not sucked into it. So we're swimming against a tide, and we need to support each other to do that. And that's why this whole idea of developing Sangha is so important and so precious. That jewel.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you could interpret that as like, like it's. Almost like, oh well, I need to do that in order to grow, but it's more mysterious than that, isn't it? It's just being around people. I mean, we were having a conversation, Olivia, at the start of this evening, where you were saying just coming to the centre seems to just have an effect, doesn't it? Just being around other people, I think, just has an effect, and there's something quite sort of intangible about that. I mean, it's interesting for me because I came along I got involved in the late 90s, and then I had a period of about 6 or 7 years when I wasn't around a Sangha, and I was still meditating and still calling myself a Buddhist and still reading and so on. And I thought
but were you doing loads of drugs at the time?
Well, Thanks, Suvarnajyoti.
No, but wasn't that the whole, you were sort of like...
Well, I was living quite a hedonistic lifestyle, yeah, but I mean, I was doing that when I was first involved in the Sangha as well, so...
Not that we're recommending that.
No, but you've completely put me off my stride now. But, yeah, I thought...
You didn't have a Sangha.
And I didn't have a Sangha, and I thought I was doing fine. And it was only actually when I came along and started being around people that I realised that I completely wasn't for all those years, but I didn't even realise it. But you know, so I've done both, and I can hand on heart say there's just no comparison, basically. And I think we live in a culture, just you talking about the culture that we're swimming against, we live in a culture that actually says, it's this thing I was saying a bit before about, I think, is that you just need the right information, you just need the right instruction. Therefore, you can just, you can go on the internet, or you can go on an app or whatever, and just, as long as you get the right instruction, it will have the right effect, and you're off, sort of thing. And it's not like that at all. It's a very sort of information-based utilitarian view, which is not how Sangha works at all. And there's a reason why the Buddha built Sangha, and there's a reason why there's been spiritual communities since that time. Is that's a wonderful way to live, and that's, it's not like a utilitarian thing of, oh well, I'm doing this because I want to make progress, but paradoxically it will be almost impossible to make progress if you don't. Does that make sense? So I'm not saying that to do that because you're trying to get something.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, no, but there is, I think maybe at the beginning of people's journeys, I'm just trying to think of people that I know, you have to have that you have to get the taste of it first to see it. So sometimes you think, okay, well, I think maybe particularly for people, if you're a bit more shy or a bit more introverted, okay, I'm going to make myself join in this Sangha thing, or I'm going to book on this retreat. And for some people that's, quite a challenge to sort of engage in it with a group of people. So initially you might do it a bit to say, okay, well, people have said that this is going to be a good thing. But then I think once you've got a taste of that, do you see what I mean?
I do.
It's a bit like people saying, oh, go and learn to meditate because it's good for you.
Right, yeah. Also, I don't know, there's something about inspiration, isn't there, I think? I just when I first came along here, I was inspired by a particular teacher, and I just wanted to keep coming along because I was so inspired by what I'd heard. It put me in mind of, so Sangha Bhante has this wonderful aphorism where he says that the Dharma is caught and not taught. And I think that sums up what we're talking about, really.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking, actually, should we... I was going to say, let's take your question, and also if other people have questions or other things that you want to ask as well. Go on, you wanted to ask a question. The what, sorry?
What is the definition of Sangha?
It's a spiritual, it's a community of people who are practicing Buddhism together.
Oh,
okay. So like the people sitting in this room, for example, we're all Sangha at different levels.
But it means that, and it also means, sort of enlightened beings of the past and the Buddhas, and so it's on lots of different levels, really. Yeah.
Is that Sanskrit language?
Sangha, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else got any questions about what we've talked about so far? No?
Do people recognise what we're saying in their experiences of Sangha, being on retreats, or in other spiritual communities? It might not be our one. I see a few people nodding really shyly. I'll take that as a yes.
Okay.
Shall we go on to
the
fourth
let's do
one?
that. Okay, so the fourth sangra vastu is, the Sanskrit is samanatata, and it's exemplification. So it's kind of the thing that I was talking about, actually, with being inspired. I think I was inspired by somebody who seemed to be putting into practice what it was that they were talking about and what I'd heard. So I think this is the thing. This is the difference between we can read the Dharma and we can read the Buddha's teachings, but it's actually only when we see people putting it into practice that we can see what that looks like in a real human life. And I think particularly what that looks like in somebody that you might even see in front of you, or somebody that is, similar to you, living a life in London, that sort of thing. It's like, I don't think this happens consciously, but something then happens when it's like, okay, that person's been practicing this for some time, and I can see that that's had an effect on me. I often talked about this a while back. I was talking about this when it came back to this thing of myths, and there are different myths that people can live by. So when I was a young person, this was after the Star Wars phase, I was quite into the sort of the rock and roll myth. Like when I was younger, it was very sort of like, not so much the sex, but the drugs and the rock and roll. And, just that sort of archetype of the sort of quite wasted, quite out of it, but quite attractive, sort of slightly messed up, but edgy human being. Do you know what I mean? You're all looking at me like really blankly. Okay, you do. And I had this experience of like going to a gig, like, I don't know, this was like years and years and years after they'd split up, like 20 years later. My favourite band sort of reformed. I'd been really into them when I was a young man, and they were all like middle-aged men by this point, and it was really pretty tragic. Like one of them in particular had obviously just kept going with that myth and like not let up on the drugs and the drink and all that sort of thing. And it was really like, oh, wow, okay. I felt quite glad that I had left all that stuff behind. And when I came here, it's kind of the opposite. And I always say to people, look, if you're thinking about getting involved seriously with anything, really, if you're thinking about devoting your life to something, look at people who have been doing it for a long time. And how do they seem to you? Do you want to end up like that, basically? Yeah. And that's how I felt when I came along here. Was I thought these are people that have been practicing for a long time. I'm very happy if I go in that direction. Actually, there are people that I looked up to, and I thought I want to grow in that direction. So it's sort of seeing that embodied and exemplified, and at the highest level. The Bodhisattva is able to do that because they've basically seen through the things that keep us, that hold us back, basically, that make us act unskillfully in ways that cause ourselves and others unhappiness. The Bodhisattva has grown completely beyond that, so is able to exemplify these qualities of kindness, of creativity. They've got endless amounts of energy available to them. And there's this lovely phrase. So I was listening to an order member giving a talk about this, and he talked about it as having a deep spiritual reliability, which I thought was beautiful. Like, it's a really lovely quality. When you meet someone, so the Bodhisattva has this completely, but I think when you meet someone who is practicing effectively and sincerely, is that quality of spiritual reliability, which means you can trust what they say, you can rely on them. Obviously, we're not perfect, so you can't completely rely on someone, but that quality of reliability and sort of congruence and consistency, which I think is really beautiful, and the effect of that as well. So Bhante talks about it as basically behaving in a way that is consistent with the teaching, or behaving in a way that is consistent, I guess, with the Buddhist precepts as well.
So it's like walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Yeah, that's right. So sort of embodying that and the effect of that. What else did I want to say about that?
Can I say something while you're thinking about it?
So, I'll just say something quick. So just to go back to the thing I was saying as well, that doesn't mean being perfect. So there's a paradox there. So the Bodhisattva is able to completely embody that consistency and spiritual reliability. For us, there's a paradox there because we're aspiring to that, but we'll always fall short. And it's in the falling short. Actually, it's even the way that we behave within that falling short as well. But that quality of exemplification, whereby we can sort of we can be inspired at the highest level, and also we can be inspired at whatever level that happens as well. So, go on. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say the thing with sorry, I'm laughing at myself because I get a lot of my spiritual inspiration from Strictly Come Dancing. So there was a wonderful phrase used on it this year, which is, if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I really liked that. If you can't see it, you can't be it. So with the exemplification thing, I think it's fantastic to have the vision of the Bodhisattva and the Buddha and these incredible beings. But actually for me, and I think for most people, you know, if I can see someone who sort of looks a bit like me, but is further along and has all these more positive qualities, like you're saying, it just feels a bit more attainable. I'm sort of like, well, you know, if she can do it, he can do it. Then, you know, if I go in that direction, then I can be that in 10 years' time or whatever. So I think exemplification is, you know, I think Bhante says somewhere, you know, curiously, it can be someone who's actually not enlightened, in a certain sense, can be more helpful at times because you can relate to them more. Because if you can't see it, you can't be it.
That's right. He's talking about spiritual friendship, isn't he? And that's why we have...
in that quote,
yeah. So that's why we have such an emphasis on spiritual friendship in our movement, is Bhante talks about that often what we need to make progress is somebody who's just a little bit further along the path than we are. And like you say, it's because we can actually identify with them. They're not so far away that we feel a bit like, oh, I'm never gonna get there. But they're close enough that actually we have something to grow towards, I think.
And sometimes it can be someone who's your peer as well, or someone who's less experienced. We can also have other people exemplifying qualities. That's not necessarily, I mean, it tends to be someone who's further along, but you know, I've got plenty of examples when I've just felt really inspired by behaviour of people who are relatively new or haven't been coming along for very long, and I've just thought, oh my gosh, you know, and I've said to myself, pull your socks up, because you need, you know, you look at what this person, you know, how this person's being in this situation. You know, come on, you can be inspired by that. So exemplification, like, I suppose what I'm saying is you don't need to wait till you've kind of been practicing for 10 years in order to exemplify your own practice to others.
Sometimes it's not even individual either, is it? Like, sometimes you can be quite inspired by a particular team or a particular, do you know what I mean? Or like just by
a team, like
I don't know, like a particular group of people. Say, like, I've had experiences of being on retreat where the team seems to be working particularly well. And it's like a group of people embody a set of qualities for a period of time, rather than just like an individual, which also then gets away from that thing of it being a bit too individualistic, or it's all about one person. Okay, so what we thought we'd get you to do now is to get into pairs again. Maybe go with go with a different person this time, not the same pairs. And this is going to be, we're heading towards the last bit of the evening now. And think about these, the sangra vastus that we've talked about. So generosity, loving speech, beneficial activity, and exemplification. Have a think about, is there one of these that you could focus on this week? Reflect on it, put it into practice even? How would you do that? So if you were to put one of these more into practice this week, which one would it be, and how would you put it into practice in the upcoming week? So have a think about that, and you can talk about that with each other.
And the more specific you can be, the more likely it is to happen. I speak from experience.
So think about actually how could you do that as well? What is something you could do to practice one of these more, or maybe even more than one of these more? Okay, so I wonder if anyone would like to share what you were talking about, or is there anything you came up with, or yeah, go on.
Just as far as right speech goes, complaining less, moaning less.
Right. Yeah. It's a very powerful practice, that, actually, I think, because it's very easy to fall into that, isn't it?
Very.
Yeah.
But maybe you could actually put some positive speech in it, like
In
find
place.
something to say something nice about.
Yeah, or to celebrate.
I think just cutting down on the moaning is going to be enough.
Right. Okay.
Oh, is that going to be another challenge?
That's enough to be going
all
on
right.
with. Okay, that's great.
All right, good luck with that, Max.
Anyone else? Yeah.
We were talking about people that have exemplified things for us, and I thought of. I love this story. There's this order member called Stiramanus, and he got an opportunity to meet the founder of the movement here, so Sangha, and Shraddha who's his friend, didn't get a slot. So he was about to go and meet Bhante, meet Sangharashta, and it was the later stages of his life, so he might not have got another chance to meet Bhante, and he knew that Shraddha hadn't had a spot, and last minute he just nominated her to have his slot, and so she got to go instead, and that story for me, it stayed with me, because I don't know that I've ever been able to yet do something that's that generous, that really kind of puts you in a less sort of puts you at a disadvantage, or
So it means that you lose something in that. Yeah.
So much.
Yeah, that's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that's real generosity, isn't it? It's like actually when there's something that is of value to you, rather than if it's something that's easy for you to do, that's still valuable, isn't it? But it really means something to say, actually no, and I value you, so I'm prepared to miss out on something, or and actually I think the effect of that is quite something as well. Yeah, that's a lovely example. Thanks, Sophie. Yeah. Anyone else, maybe one example of how you might put one of the Sangra vastus into practice this week? Kate, yeah.
It's a very stressful time this week at my work, so I'm going to make sure to rejoice in people and to tell them what they're doing well when they're probably feeling very stressed and like they're not going to get everything done.
That's lovely. Yeah, great.
That's a great thing to do. That's a great thing to do. I find it, it's a particularly positive thing, I find, if I'm in a situation when I'm actually really, really fed up with what lots of people are doing, and I'm just fed up with everybody and they're all being rubbish. I'm not saying that's what you think of your colleagues. I'm talking about myself here.
Yeah, lots of people are more positive than that. But
is to sort of make myself look for something to rejoice in, because once you start to look for something, then that does shift it, and hopefully that will help your stress levels. So yeah, good luck with that. Great.
Right, okay, so I'm going to hand over to Suvarnajyoti for the final little bit. Yep.
Great, yes. So do try and think about those 4 Sangra vastus, the means of unification, and see if you can find ways to bring them into practice in your life, and particularly around the centre here. We're going to finish this evening with a short meditation, just to sort of just to let all of that settle. So if you'd like to set yourself up just now.